So what is libido? It's not exactly sexual energy, but rather it is pleasure derived from the body that then forms mental energy and formulates and moves developing children towards certain goals. And these are then later expressed in personalities in adulthood. So why is it called psychosexual? Well, there are several stages that focus on a different area of the body from which pleasure is formed and how the mind is motivated by the body. The areas of pleasure for each stage are specific, and our personalities develop in part from our fixations on different erogenous zones. And pleasure is defined as the release of tension, while frustration is the buildup of tension at an erogenous zone. As we move through these stages, we leave libido at each stage. Sometimes more libido is left behind as we experience both frustration and pleasure. If frustrated, lack of satiation, or we receive too much stimulation, oversatiation, then libido can fixate at a particular stage or zone. The aggregate of these libidinal fixations makes up our adult personality. The id is the drive towards pleasure, and it is curtailed throughout the various stages, especially in the anal stage, where demands begin to be made and the child is made more aware of expectations of civility. The superego is the internalized parent or society that restricts the id, and because of this conflict between the id and the superego, the ego is formed as a negotiator between what we desire and what is socially acceptable. Now, this conflict can occur at every erogenous zone and impacts the developing personality. Every child progresses through every stage and resolves them in one way or another. However, the more libido that is spent or remains at a particular stage, the more mental energy remains at that stage. And the personality under stress seeks to return to gain pleasure either due to its lack or due to its overabundance and indulgence to comfort themselves. The conflict metaphor was used by Freud, who likened libido to an advancing army, marching towards each conflict, leaving some behind to defend a rear position. A fixation occurs when an undue amount of libido is left behind at a particular stage. So what stages are there? For Freud, there are 5 stages, the first of which is the oral stage. Imagine a newborn, its primary contact and source of pleasure is through the mouth, nourishing itself through suckling, biting, teething. A lot's going on at this space. And oral personality characteristics include smokers, nail biters, finger chewers, thumb suckers, who then regress when they are put under stress. The next stage is the anal stage from ages 1 to 3, and they gain their pleasure from defecation, and this wish brings them into conflict with the outside world, their parents. The formation of the superego then forms. The ego develops to negotiate these demands with their desires. If there is a crisis in potty training, their reaction will be indicative of how they will deal with all forms of authority as an adult. And if the child is trained too harshly or too early, then they will become anal retentive. They'll hate messes, they'll be obsessively tidy, be punctual and respectful to authority, stubborn or tight-fisted. Whereas if pleasure was gained from withholding their feces when they were a toddler. On the other end, there is the anal expulsive, who was trained liberally and wants to share all things, loves giving things away, sharing their excrement. They are messy, disorganized, and rebellious. The phallic stage occurs from the ages of circa 3 to 5 or 6 years, where the genitals become the focus as kids begin to masturbate and become aware of anatomical differences. Erotic attraction begins, as well as envy, jealousy, fear, and resentment. Freud's controversial idea on the formation of the male personality is framed in the tale of Oedipus. It is the adoption of the same-sex personality characteristics. A boy will derive pleasure from the attentions of his mother, but fears that the competition, father, will find out and castrate him. To throw dad off his tracks, he imitates his father and starts to identify with him. Introspection is what brought Freud to this conclusion, and perhaps because of this methodology, he had little to say about the female development of personality, or perhaps it was too complex to theorize similarly. He does offer the electric complex for young girls' maturation, which is the identification with the mother, the realization that she does not have phallus, which she sees as power, and then envies and desires that of the father, represses this and transforms that wish for a phallus into the wish for a baby, which then fills the emptiness, and then blames her mother for her own castration. So identification with the father in the young male leads to the acceptance of the male gender role, while the repression of the desire to have the father leads to the young female taking on the female gender role. You can see how this is controversial. The complexity of sexuality, gender, identity, and personality reduced to this formula. And yet it was one of the first theories and provided a good beginning, at least for the approach to interpretation of symbols as psychologically motivated. Now, the final two stages occur without much fanfare. The latency stage occurs from 5 to 6 to puberty. And nothing really happens there. Hobbies and interests are developed as the drives are sublimated by the superego, dominance, and the wish to please. And finally, from puberty to adult, the genital stage occurs and the personality settles down into a monogamous relationship. Now, the theory is no longer in use among psychoanalysts, but as mentioned, it provides a fruitful way of reading tropes and symbols of our mediums that express desires and fantasies, which is especially useful for dreams and fairy tales and fantasy as well as film.